So if the antagonist wins, right, things get worse. So it's a situation where at this point, right, so it says, as you interpret the play, you're looking at like a situation where in the falling action, right, how is what's going on in the falling action leading back to this idea of agency and character arc? Okay. Now, it says to write a quick essay that explains how change in people archetypally is related to agency. So I got some questions in terms of like, oh, Mr. What question are we answering, right? Well, okay, here's the question. How does the change in people, how do people change archetypally? There's the question, right? Again, like, other than given the subject, other than like nobody's like going to walk you through or answer the question for you, right? So write a quick essay on how the change in people archetypally is related to agency, right? Or how is, if you need a question, there you are. How is the change in people archetypally related to agency? Okay. So then the introduction discusses the archetype as usual, right? So again, all introductions are archetypal. So if your body paragraph is about, let's go to what the handouts that I gave you on essay writing, right? And it's kind of, hopefully I'm not, okay, let's scroll here. So there we go. So again, with the introduction, right, you're pretty much looking at what the main point or the macro inference that you're trying to make. It should be something that's small enough or specific enough that you feel confident that you've covered every detail dealing with it by the end of the paper, and there's nothing that's left out, right? But then in the other one that I gave you, and I'm looking for that. So it's a synthesis or clear understanding of the micro inferences that you made intertextually. So if you're looking at different texts, okay, this is what's being said about the human condition, right? So as well as conceptual inferences that clarify a statement about the human condition overall, right? And that's the archetypal condition. So if you're writing even a science paper where you've read, you're in pharmacy college and you've made a whole bunch of understandings and you've analyzed a whole bunch about pharmacy. Well, guess what? Those pills don't necessarily deal with just one person, right? You're learning about the archetypal situation with how that particular biochemistry works with people in general, right? And that's the same thing pretty much with every essay that you're writing. So with the introduction, it's a situation where it's the main focus. Now, this is one of the reasons why in the body, right, and all that thesis always comes from some sort of analysis that you've done beforehand, right? That's the difference between an evaluation and an opinion. That's a difference between a thesis and, some sort of general concept, right? Thesis has a lot of analysis behind it. So that's why I said with the body, it says like analyze what went on into developing your thesis, right? So what process did you go through to synthesize your thesis? And this is the first part of the essay that you write. And this is one of the reasons why you should write the body, is the fact that your introduction or your thesis is going to be a lot more solid. Okay. So now going back to the analysis of the section that I gave you. Okay. So it says, the introduction discusses the archetype as usual. The body provides all the interpretations and inferences in your analysis. And the conclusion provides a schema application that tests how archetypal the thesis is. All right. All right. So let's get to this. So soliloquy analysis, right? And again, this is a soliloquy and not a monologue. And keep in mind that, again, the difference between a monologue and a soliloquy is a soliloquy that he's on stage by himself, right? Versus a monologue where he's the only one speaking and everyone else is on the stage. All right. So he says, to be thus is nothing, right? But to be safely thus, right? Our fears in Banquo, right? Now, some people were saying that like it was Banquo's fear. It's not Banquo's fear, right? He says our fears in Banquo. Now, when he says our, he doesn't necessarily mean a bunch of people, right? He's basically talking about who? Our. Well, he's talking about himself, right? His fear in Banquo. Okay, so then he says, stick deep. So to be thus is nothing but to be safely thus. So to be thus, right? So let's go backwards. To be thus, right? So to be this, to be what it is, right? Is nothing, right? But to be safely thus. And then there's a hyphen there. So we'll basically, like before the dash, we're going to stop, right? Because so you also have a period there. So that means that you're going to be stopped and you're going to look at the information in front of the semicolon there and after the semicolon, right? And that's a relationship. And then in between that, you have a conjunction. You have the but. Basically saying that there's a contrast that's going on there, right? So to be thus is nothing, right? So to be in the situation that I'm in is absolutely nothing. But to be safely thus, right? So to be safely thus, in other words, that's thus is the same thus, right? But to be in this situation is nothing, but to be safely in this situation. Now, what situation is he talking about? Right? What situation did he actually finally, achieve? Right? So to have achieved the thing that he just achieved, right, is one thing. But to safely have achieved what he just achieved is another thing, right? And the second part is more important to him, to safely have done so. Then he says, our fears in Banquo stick deep, right? Now, again, we're not looking at that idea as being independent of the ideas that come before it, right? All reading is a chain of ideas, and each idea relates to the previous idea. So our fears in Banquo stick deep is related back to this idea of being safe in the thing that he has achieved. Right? Now, again, keep in mind of who Banquo as a non-thesis character represents, right? And we've already talked about several times what Banquo represents as a non-thesis character. Two things, right? He represents the best friend of Macbeth, yes, right? But he also represents what? The conscience of Macbeth as well. And he's made certain statements, especially at the beginning of this, in terms of being the conscience of Macbeth. And then he is talking next about Banquo. He says, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. Right? Now, again, there's the pronoun there, his. Right? So his is going back to who? Right? So pronouns represent nouns. His is going back to who? Banquo. Right? So in Banquo's royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. Right? And in talking about Banquo, he talks about the fact of his royalty of nature. Right? So it's this idea of Banquo's nature or his characteristics or something about who he is, right? His traits makes him somewhat of a what? Royal figure, right? Or going back to this idea of fears, kingly figure. So in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. There's something kingly, there's something noble about Banquo that makes Macbeth afraid of Banquo, right? And what is that thing, right? Again, that goes back to Banquo's purpose as a non-thesis character in this play, right? And his purpose is what? The conscience, right? So Banquo being noble, Banquo being truthful, Banquo being pretty much what Macbeth has given up, right? Because at this point, again, this being the falling action, Macbeth has given up on the loyalty. He's given up on, his old self, right? And Banquo represents the voice of the old self, right? The voice of the loyal. 'Tis much he dares, right? And to that dauntless temper of his mind, right? So this idea of like the dauntless temper, like in other words, if something is daunting, it gets in your way. Like it's difficult if something is daunting, right? But here he says dauntless, right? So in this particular case, if you add the less to daunt, it's the opposite, right? So the dauntless temper of his mind. In other words, if Banquo gets the idea, the idea of being right-minded, right? Is anything going to get in his way, right? There's the word dauntless, right? The dauntless temper of his mind. Nothing is going to get in the way. And think about how Banquo has behaved to this point. When they first encountered the witches, when the first prophecy was professed, what did Banquo do? Pretty much each time has Banquo failed in his attempt or failed in his job, right? Of being Macbeth's conscience, right? So it says, he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valor to act in safety, right? And there's that idea of valor, right? And it's a situation where, again, right? How did Macbeth start off, right? As whose minion? Valor's minion, right? So at the beginning of his character arc, right? Both Macbeth and Banquo were pretty much acting with valor, right? They were Valor's minions. Now, while Macbeth, being a complex character, being a round character, has changed in that, right? And he has had a character arc. Did we get a character arc for Banquo? No, right? Because Banquo is a non-thesis character. He's the flat character. So he hath a wisdom that doth guide his valor to act and safety. Right? Now, notice where the period stops, right? So that whole idea here, right, from here all the way up, right? It's pretty much making a statement. And your job is to figure out what that statement actually is, right? Now, then the next part, it says, there is none but he whose being do I fear, and under him my genius is rebuked. Right? So there's none but he whose being I do fear, and under him my genius is rebuked. Is rebuked. So who is the he? Right? There's only one person that he's talking about. Under him. Again, only one person that he's talking about. Who is the I? Is the person that is speaking, right? Which is Macbeth, right? And then why does he fear? He's pretty much told you what it is that he's feared up here in this section in the yellow, right? And as it says, Mark Antony's was by Caesar. That's a whole different thing. Requiring a schema connection. We're going to skip over that because of the fact that for the most part you guys have not read Caesar, but it is interesting if you want to actually go into that and do some background reading. So there is none but he whose being I do fear, and under him my genius is rebuked. So his genius is what he, like his plan, right? That got him where he is, right? But my genius is rebuked. Okay, so then you go online and you take a look and you look and see what rebuked means, right? So basically it's a situation where, like, with him, everything that he's done to get to this point, right, is pretty much nullified, right, by something about, right? I'm sorry, there's a burp there. It's pretty much nullified by something about Banquo. And then he goes into the nitty gritty in this next part about what he is upset about, right? He chid the sisters when they first put the name of king upon me and bade them speak to him, right? So he chid the sisters when they first put the name of king upon me and bade them speak to him, right? So there's a tone here, right? Because in one way of reading this is thinking that Macbeth is interpreting this. Let's unitalicized this. He's reading this idea of chide as, Banquo was like, you're getting these really great things, well, give me something too, and I think that speaks more so to Macbeth's attitude at this point in time, right? So keep in mind that, like, he's sort of saying, well, he jumped in and, when they were talking about me being king, he jumped in, right? And bade them speak to him, right? It's like, well, what about me, right? And again, that pretty much ignores the fact that Banquo has been, for the most part, telling Macbeth all this time, what about the witches? Can the devil speak true, right? Oftentimes, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness, right? Which is the devil's trope, get us to harm ourselves, right? Cause ourselves to, to create this terrible consequence against ourselves, right? So the idea here that, that Banquo was looking for something from the very people that he's been warning Macbeth about, sort of speaks to Macbeth's frame of mind. He's only seeing it in a particular type of way, right? That as objective readers, we're seeing a different thing, right? Or as analytic readers, we're seeing a different thing. And this sort of gets into his jealousy, right? So these two parts. And this is what, often you'll hear your professors next year, if we do have universities still going on in August. Hopefully things get better. But often you'll hear your professors talk about like tone, and you might have heard your other English teachers talking about tone. So this gets into the sort of like tone switches of, of characters, and how that tone can sort of inform you how their motivations and their intentions sort of change. And this is like where like reasoning and motivation is different from like cause and effect, right? Cause and effect tends to be more so actual physical things that happen that, that lead to other events, this is more so motivation and reasoning, where it's a situation where the events that actually happen are sort of clouded over, and sort of augmented, in a certain way, by Macbeth. He's seeing things a little differently now because, again, at this point, he's sort of really swept up by, the falling action of his choice, right? And that choice being what? Giving in to the antagonist, giving in to the ambition, giving in to being the object of agency. So then he says, then prophet-like, they hailed him the father to a line of kings. So again, what does this show, right? Let's look at this again. This is very different, right, than the Macbeth at the beginning of the play. Right? Would the Macbeth at the beginning of the play have cared anything about anything in terms of prophecies, right? And then it's also dealing with the dramatic irony that's going on here, because is it even an actual prophecy, right? So the Macbeth in the beginning of the play, when you're thinking about it, really is more correct. And the Macbeth that we have now is really more so, living off of his ignorances, right? And having made a decision that at this point, having killed the king, he can't take back. You can't unkill someone, right? He just keeps going forward, right? And he says, upon my head, they placed a fruitless crown. All right. So I'm not going to interpret this one for you, but I am going to highlight it. All right. So they placed so it says, upon my head, right? They placed a fruitless crown. This is massive. Right? That right there. Actually, let me put this in yellow. So upon my head, they placed a fruitless crown. Right? And those two statements are related to each other. Okay. Prophet like, they hailed him father to a line of kings. Upon my head, they placed a fruitless crown. And put a barren scepter, right? Okay, hold on a second. Okay. And placed a barren scepter. So barren scepter in my grip, in my grip, right? So it says gripe, but it should be grip. It's the way that it was. So put a barren scepter in my grip. Right? So barren being empty. A scepter is sort of what a king would carry that sort of indicates that he is king. One of the things I think about is sort of, which I need to rewatch, in the Avengers, the thing that, or was it the Avengers or was it Black Panther? There's a scene where the guy is like the Panther guy, not the Panther guy, but the I guess the ape or the monkey people. This is a scene where he's like up and he's got like the staff in his hand. So it's sort of like, yeah, so it's like put a barren staff in my hand, or a barren symbol of my kinglyship in my grasp, in my grip, right? And the idea of something being barren being empty, okay? So thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, right? So lineal being lineage, so unlineal, so not having a lineage, right? So then to be wrenched with an unlineal hand. No son of mine succeeding. So let's highlight that as well. So no son of mine succeeding. So we're going to highlight that as well. Okay. That's pretty much straightforward. If it be so, for Baron's issue have I filed my mind, right? So for Banquo's issue, by issue he means kids, right? So for Banquo's kids, have I filed my mind. So for Banquo's kids, have I filed my mind, right? And another way of thinking about filed would be like defiled, right? So if you look up defiled, So for Banquo's issue have I defiled my mind. Right? For them, the gracious Duncan have I murdered. That's pretty much straightforward. Them being a pronoun, right? Meaning going back to this idea of issue, or issue being kids. And whose kids? Banquo's kids. Put rancors in the vessel of my peace, right? So rancor is like a nettle, or, like, I don't know if you've ever gone through some bushes and you'll get like these little prickly little things on your socks, and like you're just walking and all of a sudden you're like, ow, or like a little rock or something like that. And every time you take a step, you're like, ooh, ouch, until you like take it off. So think about like a bunch of those, but when he says in the vessel of my peace, right? So in this particular case, the vessel of my peace being his soul, right? So put rancors in the vessel of my peace. So his soul is being sort of tortured. Only for them, and them being who, right? So what noun is that going back to? So put rancors in only for them, right? And mine eternal jewel, again, being his soul. Another way of looking at peace, other than his soul, like his soul would also be like his, what he said, we already dealt with this, that he can't what? He cannot what? He cannot sleep. All right. So think about going back to that. And mine eternal jewel, again, being his soul, given to the common enemy of man. Now this is huge. So the common enemy of man, and this is pretty much in archetypal to any religion, right? Would be some sort of demon or devilish figure, right? So mine eternal jewel given to the common enemy of man. So at this point, he knows that his soul, right? His eternal jewel right there has been given to who? The devil, right? And so why has his soul been given to the devil? Because he knows that in his killing Duncan, right, he has pretty much condemned himself, right, to